First game we're talking about today is number 20 Oklahoma State at number 23 Kansas State, noon Eastern time on ESPN. Really, the storylines to know for this game is pretty simple. These are two teams desperate to get back on track in a wide-open Big 12. Both of them suffered their first losses of the season this past weekend. Oklahoma State lost to then number 12 Utah, 22-19. Kansas State, far more embarrassing. They lost to an unranked team at the time in BYU by a 38-9 final score. But the winner of this game is right back in the thick of it in a wide open Big 12 race. But the loser of this game pretty much can't lose another conference game the rest of the season. Dome. I was looking at it. Pretty much every Big 12 championship game featured a team that had 2 losses or fewer in the conference play. So if you lose this game, you're still kind of alive, but you cannot lose another game the rest of the season. So if you want to make a college football playoff and even Big 12 championship game. So really, this is a massive game for two teams trying to get back on track right now.
No, absolutely. And I think the theme here is you've got two teams that just struggled. They got out of their element offensively last week, right, where they both fell behind. Both of them want to run the ball, and they just were not able to run the ball. Or, I mean, K-State ran the ball pretty well, but they're not built to function from big deficits like that, right? And 3 turnovers for the first time since last year's game against Oklahoma State, which they also lost. You know, you got two teams that can't function with turnovers, and we've talked about Ollie Gordon in Oklahoma State. If they don't get him going, I'm not sure where they're going to go this season. It's just they can't. Alan Bowman's a good quarterback, but he's not a guy that you want carrying you week in and week out. And I think the same goes for Avery Johnson, at least on the passing side, where he's so young, but he's not ready to be relied on to throw the ball 35, 40, 45 times, right?
Definitely. So, Dawn, you have the Kansas State offense in this game. What should we be looking out for when Avery Johnson and the Wildcats have the ball?
So I think it was obviously a really tough game, and they got out-physicaled at BYU, and it's just a game where you go, okay, they got beat in all 3 phases. They got beat really soundly. But coming out of that game, it's not like there's any mystery as to what K-State's identity is, right? It's still their run game. Like I don't think even in a loss, you know, we mentioned it that against Arizona, it wasn't a statement game. That's just Kansas State.
Yeah.
Last week in a loss in the same way, it was Kansas State. If you get ahead of them and they turn the ball over and they can't just lean on the run game while they're playing from ahead the entire time, that's also where they struggle. That's a part of their identity. So at the very least, they're a known commodity. And they had a loss or two like this early last year, and they just kept riding. They're going to stay consistent, and they're going to keep leaning on this run game. We've talked about it before. Avery Johnson, DJ Giddens, Dylan Edwards. That's the heart and soul of this team. And last week, even through some struggles in the passing game, on defense, on special teams, right, they still ran for 233 yards and had 8 explosive runs. So they're going to continue to stick with the formula. This is not a team that needs to make drastic changes or go, oh man, we need to drastically improve this passing game and change up the passing game this week. No, they just need to stick to their identity. And I think they will be able to do that against Oklahoma State, who, if you exclude sacks, they're allowing more than 200 rushing yards a game. Oklahoma State's run defense has not been great. It wasn't great against Utah last week. Against South Dakota State, they gave up well over 100 yards. Arkansas ran all over them. They have an opportunity here with this rushing offense to get right. Even a team like Tulsa ran on Oklahoma State. It's just been a weakness. And what is the one thing that I always talk about with K-State and opposing defenses? Who needs to play well?
The linebackers.
The linebackers.
Yep.
And the problem is Oklahoma State is having similar issues at linebacker as Arizona was when we were previewing that game. And what happened to Arizona's linebackers in that game? Big-time struggle, right?
Yep.
And I told you, last year, linebackers, when they were facing Kansas State, had a 42 run D grade. It's closer in the 50s because BYU's unit played well last week, but Oklahoma State linebackers right now have the 4th lowest run D grade in the Power 5. It is the same challenge where 2 players in particular, Nicholas Martin and Jeff Roberson, they have to play their A game if they're gonna keep up with Kansas State in this game. In Manhattan, look, they beat K-State last year because K-State, they were throwing the ball more. They still had Will Howard starting. And they turned the ball over 3 times in that game. K-State's going to lean more on the run game because Avery Johnson's a more dynamic athlete than Will Howard was. And it's incumbent on these Oklahoma State linebackers to keep up. I feel very much the same about this matchup as I did when we previewed Arizona. Those are the guys that need to play better in their run defense, because otherwise, look, we've seen it in multiple games, even in games they've won. Oklahoma State has struggled in run defense, and that only gets harder as Colin Oliver continues to miss games.
Yeah, absolutely. And Dawn, one side of the ball is all about the run game. The other side of the ball is all about the run game as well. My matchup I'm looking for, will we ever see the 2023 version of Ollie Gordon ever again, honestly? Because he entered the year as our number 2 player in college football. Last year, led the nation in rushing yards, was second in rushing touchdowns, and yards after contact, won the Doak Walker Award as just a true sophomore. But this year, he has been very disappointing. Dolan, right now, he's tied for 6th in the country in carries, but he's 70th in rushing yards right now. He now has 3 straight games with fewer than 50 yards rushing. He only had 4 games below 50 yards all of last season, including the games where he wasn't really getting the ball that much, honestly, either. So I will say the offensive line has really not done him any favors either. Right now, he's averaging 0.6 yards before contact per attempt. That's the 9th lowest in the country right now. And it won't get much easier against a Kansas State defense right now that is 31st in the country in yards per attempt allowed at 3.9, and they only give up 0.9 yards before contact on average. So the Cowboys, if you notice that game against Utah, they were very one-dimensional, and Alan Bowman had to kind of win that game for them, and he couldn't do it. I'm worried right now that Alan Bowman and those receivers, I think it's a solid receiving core, but overall, it's an above-average passing game overall. If they don't get Ollie Gordon going, and if he does not become the superstar that he was last year, I have serious worries about this Oklahoma State offense and serious worries about this Oklahoma State team, and I think they desperately need him this Saturday against Kansas State to get back to his sophomore form.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they rode Ollie Gordon all the way to the Big 12 title game last year, and that's really – you go, why was Oklahoma State supposed to be good this year? Ollie Gordon.
Yep.
And Alan Bowman's a more complimentary piece, and they do. They have good receivers, Stribling and Brennan Presley, and guys who have played well so far in the receiving core, but it's not a passing game you're expecting to carry, right? It's not one of the 4 or 5 big-time passing games even within the conference, right? It was supposed to be complimentary to take the pressure off Gordon, but right now if they're not getting it done in the run game, and you're right, whereas K-State has a clear identity, even through a loss, and a big loss at that, they're going to keep that identity. I don't know what Oklahoma State's identity is right now.
No, I don't either, Dawn, honestly. That's a little alarming for this Oklahoma State team right now. So what is your prediction for this game, and who gets back on track, and who gets back into the Big 12 title race, and who suffers a devastating blow for their playoff chances?
I've got Kansas State 30-20. I just think that having that clear identity, getting to go home, getting to now, okay, you got punched in the stomach. You did. You went out to BYU, and they got physically outplayed, and they made mistakes, turnover, punt return touchdowns, breakdowns in coverage. They got all – I don't know if they got all their mistakes out in one game, but they must feel like, okay, let's just leave it in the past. Sometimes you get a loss, and you get so soundly beaten in all 3 phases that you go, you know what? Just flush it.
Yep.
We'll watch the tape for 2-3 hours, and we're just going to flush it, and we're going to get back to doing what we do, and we're just going to play a better game. And I think that's where Kansas State is at right now. I don't think that the struggles between these two teams are the same. I think Oklahoma State has fundamental issues. I think Kansas State, for now, played just one really, really bad game and can bounce back. They did it last year. They had an early loss. I remember it was on a Friday night to Oklahoma State, where it was just like, boy, what is with them? And they came back and they rattled it off until I think their last game of the season. They lost to Iowa State. They went on a big run after that. So I think it's just kind of gut check time. I think people have to remember Avery Johnson is a really young guy. He's going to go through those things, right? It's his first year starting. He's not the most refined passer in the world. This is their identity, win or loss, but at least they can be consistent with that. I don't know what Oklahoma State's identity is right now, offensively or defensively. Their secondary's okay, but if their front 7 keeps playing like it's been playing, they're going to have a hard time in this game. K-State 30-20.
I honestly know Colin Oliver is a huge loss.
Big loss.
He is a really, really good player. And Don, I think you said it perfectly. Kansas State knows exactly who they are. And I'm picking Kansas State in this game as well, 27-24. They know exactly who they are, and even in that loss to BYU, they stayed the same. It was just ended up being the worst part of that, honestly. Oklahoma State is having an identity crisis right now because now all of a sudden, like we said before, entering the year, it was like, okay, Ollie Gordon, give him 50 carries a game, let him carry you to the Big 12 title game like last year, and he's not doing that right now. So it's a little bit of an identity crisis. Right now, I think this game is going to come down to who can run the football better, and I believe in Kansas State's three-headed monster in that backfield, especially against that Oklahoma State run D that's been a little vulnerable this year, more so than Ollie Gordon, who's been very, very slow to start his season against a Kansas State run D that's been pretty good. So again, like I said, it's going to be who runs the football better, and I think Kansas State is going to win that battle 27-24.
I think the one thing that needs to be said, too, is on paper, if you didn't watch the game, Oklahoma State lost by 3 points.
It was not a 3-point game.
Utah blasted them.
Yeah.
It was 22-3, and then they kind of laid off the gas the last 7-8 minutes or so. That they were dominated by Utah. If you just looked at the final score, you don't get the full story of that game. Utah was the better team on the field for pretty much the entire game, and then Oklahoma State messed around and made the score closer. But they got dominated, and I came out of that game. I came out of last week with a lot more questions about Oklahoma State than Kansas State.
Which is ironic considering Kansas State had a much more embarrassing loss. But it's like, no, you still know who they are.
They got, to be honest with you, the way they both got beat wasn't all that different.
Yeah.
It's just the final score made it look different for Oklahoma State. But at the end of, like, to me, in my gut, I see that game as 22-3 the way that it was before the final.
Another reason why the Kansas State one, we're not trying to say the Kansas State one wasn't bad, but they were in Provo at night in a raucous environment. Meanwhile, Oklahoma State was at home. And also, keep in mind, Isaac Wilson was playing at quarterback. It wasn't like Cam Rising was back there. You had a true freshman in Isaac Wilson who, quite frankly, was bad against Oklahoma State. He had like a 35 passing grade, and they still got outplayed in that game. So both of us taking Kansas State in that game.